Thank you. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction about us and the real-world kind of example of where we've applied some of these things and kind of where we're going with it. But before I introduce there, just a quick word about us. I'm CEO of SourceFuse. We're a global team of about 150 people, and we're product builders. And what we do is we like to work with organizations to find those untapped opportunities and come in and be able to apply startup practices to the enterprise. So agile releases, leveraging new technology, and best-in-class services like all the AWS suite, like PubNub, and put these to work to solve real-world problems based on data and outcomes and iterate really quickly on those. And so that's how we do it. And so now what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce one real-world example of that, a large organization that we've been able to help apply some of these things. And you can hear about the business case where that comes from. And then some of the specific technology implementations we've already done that are in production, and then kind of where we're going with it to apply some of the Amazon ML and these other services to have further gains and real-world results. So the company is OneCall, and Joe McCullough, Executive Vice President, is going to kind of lay out kind of what they do, and then Kabir from our team will talk about kind of how we solve some of those problems. So Joe McCullough, OneCall, here you go.
Thanks, Kelly. Good afternoon. Hopefully what it can do today for you is really kind of bring everything you've heard so far, kind of demonstrate that in a business case. My job at OneCall is a Senior Vice President of products, specifically around the development. So basically it means I get to think of all the really cool things that we could potentially do and then go to folks like Kelly and PubNub and Amazon to say, how would we do this? So what I want to do today is kind of show you what we did. Before that, I'll tell you a little bit about OneCall. Important to understand that we are the #1 market leader, specifically in the workers' compensation market, across several different verticals we'll get into. #1 in revenue. If you combine the revenue of our competitors, we'd probably still be more than they would in aggregate. The verticals we have across these 6 range from diagnostic services, MRIs, all the way down to doctor and dental. We're going to specifically today kind of concentrate on transport and translate, which kind of nicely go into the things we've talked about. The transport translate vertical has been around for over 2 decades. Most of all these we refer to these as an ancillary space in healthcare. And while we definitely focus on the workers' compensation aspect, what we also are getting ready to launch into other healthcare adjacent markets as a result of the technology and what we built today around the transportation translate piece. So a little bit about the business case, transportation. As you can see, transportation in healthcare is a problem, specifically as a social determinant, and is one of the things that you can actually control. We have clients that it's not unlikely that they have upward of 30+% missed medical appointments. What's the problem? The problem was typically you only had transportation in use if you were transportation dependent. But what if you actually could use transportation to drive down those missed medical appointments? So there is a consciousness shifting in the marketplace that transportation is not just an expense. It's actually a cost avoidance factor that you can layer in. That 10 billion of missed of that 150 is directly attributed to transportation. But as I said, as a shift in the marketplace, people are saying maybe it's better to use the transportation and pay for a $25 ride to be sure someone gets to a dialysis appointment. So what did it look like before in transportation? Typically, it would go something like this. Patient needs a ride, calls the contact center, agent answers the phone, says, yes, 2 p.m. tomorrow, Mrs. Smith will be ready to take you, hangs up the phone, enters some information into the system, picks up a phone, calls a transportation provider, maybe the contact center's in Atlanta, calls a transportation provider in Jacksonville and says, can you take Ms. Smith to her appointment tomorrow at 2 p.m.? Transportation provider says, certainly I can do that. Great, it's booked, we'll all keep our fingers crossed and hope it works. I might call the transportation provider tomorrow, make sure you're still going to pick up Ms. Smith. Yep, I've got it. An hour goes by, 3 o'clock, Miss Smith's not picked up, picks up the phone, calls the transportation company or the broker would then call the provider. Where are you? I'm only 10 minutes away. Maybe they get Miss Smith there, and then she's stranded for 3 hours later waiting for a return ride. That's notorious in the healthcare market for transportation. Nothing was real time. Providers have trip logs, electronic signatures they have to collect, missed appointments. Imagine a missed appointment to a dialysis treatment. So the consequences are very real. So what we came up with is, wouldn't it really be cool to have real-time visibility in the transportation rides? How do you do that? What we did is we, at the time, a couple years ago, said, what if we integrate it with Lyft? Tapped into their health API. Could actually dispatch that ride real time. Actually could get alerts real time. Tell the patient who's picking them up, what the car looks like, the license plate number, the ETA. And when they need a return ride, call us or click a button, reply in an SMS text through a workflow, and we'll dispatch the ride immediately for you. So we actually have agents real time monitoring those rides. And the key word is real time. And most of the time I have to tell everybody, stop watching the cars go around, the alerts will take care of it for you. And when things come off the rails, we can actually intervene. What does that translate it into? We have a stat called unable to performs. And unable to performs are really something, meaning something happened. We had something scheduled. And they actually take place in metropolitan areas. We've seen an 80% improvement in the unable to performs when we use this solution, because we have the real-time visibility. A driver cancels, no big deal, we can dispatch another one. You're going to be late to your appointment, not a big deal. We can call the facility, let them know, and make sure you can still be seen. So the impact is very real. We've been using this program for about 1.5 years now, so it's real data. And as you can see there, a couple 100,000 rides, over 400 health clinics using Relay today. Average ETA, the 8 minutes, 13 seconds, and the cost, a little under $25. So this is data that our customers find very helpful. Comparatively, we can monitor the rides before, not monitor, but we could tell you how many you had in a year. I could not tell you what's the average waiting time for your patient to be picked up. I can give you an average cost, but not down like I can today. And so what we've seen through the health clinics using this is that they've actually really been able to impact their no-show rates. Their no-show rates are, of course, associated with their revenue. So it's very advantageous for them as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we've been able to do with the transportation, the real-time piece of it, as well as what Kabir is going to be speaking to about the translate piece, and how we kind of came across a use case to give it even more detail. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Kabir. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so sticking with what Joe basically left us with was two key components, right? He mentioned real time, at least 10 times. So that's key to getting these people to their doctors on time. And the second thing is communication, right? Every step of the way, you've got to keep the patients, the drivers, everyone involved updated on what's happening. So which is why this was really a good, an ideal synergy of the two technologies that we've talked about, right? So we talked about Amazon's machine learning services, Poly, text-to-speech. We talked about Lex, conversational bots. We've talked about Translate, for obvious translation services. And then we talked about PubNub, which is the real-time messaging framework. Now, put both of those things together, and what you get is really massive efficiency for these kind of operations. So before I actually dive into what we actually ended up building for OneCall, just like to go over a brief architecture of our application. So what you saw on this screen, really, those are the sort of agent portals that agents at OneCall use to sort of orchestrate book rides, facilitate them, helps them keep updated in real time on what's happening on the ride. There's geolocation of the actual Lyft ride happening, on that second screen. And on the first one, you can see there are a bunch of, red, amber, and blue alerts, which basically is telling agents that, the patient might be late, or, the driver canceled. So essentially, what's happening is agents are being updated in real time and are able to take corrective action to make sure that the patient actually gets to their appointment, on time. So, brief architecture overview. We started off, with a typical monolith, a couple of years ago. As the application and the platform got sort of absorbed into the enterprise, scaled nicely, at which point of time we started moving towards a more microservices architecture. As we added more providers, as we added customer integrations and so forth. And as can be seen here, key components is really the PubNub piece feeding into both actually agents on the one-call side, as well as patients. So what's important here to mention is that this is really an omni-channel solution, right? So what we're trying to do is give this service, across demographics, across all ages, across people that are high tech, low tech, access to mobile phones, maybe just feature phones, and so forth. And then we obviously have big audit log database that we use. Our sort of data team uses to figure out how we can improve patient outcomes, and what are those features that we can introduce to improve the system. And then lastly, we obviously have the AWS Connect, and Poly integration that we'll speak to right now. All right. So what was the problem really? This is the problem statement, what was happening before. Obviously after, like Joe said, after the system was introduced, there were massive efficiencies in getting patients on time, a lot of cost savings, a lot of automation, and it was great. But when we dug into the data, we actually saw that there was a certain section of the users, the patients, that were still missing or getting late for a lot of appointments. So schedule adherence, getting to the doctor's appointment on time was still a problem. When we dug deep enough, we realized that these patients were still using landline phones, right? So important, fact is that, just over 50%, I think it's 50.2% of all US households are still non-wireless homes, right? There's still a lot of landline usage these days. So, I mean, the problem was clear. We just needed a solution. So, and AWS ML services were basically just coming out at the time, and it seemed like a perfect fit. So what you can see here is what used to happen was the system used to send the SMS text, but they were never really delivered. Hence, the patient never got the information that the appointment was booked for them. The patient never got the information that the taxi was actually reaching their house, say in 20 minutes. Hence, they either missed their appointment or they were late for their appointment, and obviously, unfavorable sort of patient outcome. So what we did was we replaced the SMS text sort of workflow for these kinds of patients with sort of the AWS Poly workflow, right? So what we did with that was we'd use AWS Connect, which is their call center in the cloud solution. And what's great about that is you don't need to provision any infrastructure. It's your DevOps team can basically roll that out within hours. And you plug in the Poly flow. And what you're able to do is then make automated phone calls to patients, who traditionally would not have even received those messages, and keep them abreast on what's happening. This is your appointment. You got to be ready at this time. The taxi is coming to your house in 20 minutes, and so forth. So you can see over there, there's an example of one of the calls that we make. So this is an automated phone call from Relay Solutions. Your transportation has been arranged, and we tell them all about, this is your Lyft driver. He's coming, in a red Fiat. He's going to be there in 10 minutes, and so on. So a lot of anxiety, and on the part of the patient has now been reduced. He knows that someone's on the way. They're going to reach their appointment on time, which is really meaningful impact, right? So what you've got to realize is a lot of this, so these are worker compensation cases. A lot of these are injured workers, that may have limited mobility. If they can't get to their appointment on time, it's going to cause a delay in, them finally getting better and so forth. So the next slide is actually going to show us a couple of example calls that we make. So you can see, in the white box is an example. It says, "Good morning, Kabir. This is an automated call from Relay Solutions. Your transportation has been arranged by OneCall on behalf of, whoever OneCall's customer is. Date and time, and you'll receive the details of the driver when you pick up. If you need additional help, you can just call your agent like you traditionally did. And come the time of the appointment, the person gets another call on their landline telling them, this is another automated call. Your Lyft driver, Jamie, is on his way. He's coming in on a Skoda Octavia. This is his license plate, and he'll be there in 3 minutes. So all of that sort of has been taken care of in an automated fashion. I wish we could have heard the call, but on the right side of it is essentially the SSML, which is the speech synthesis markup language that we use to sort of make these calls. So it's not. So the good thing about Poly is it's just not. You don't give it a string and ask it to convert it to text. It's quite rich, in its feature set. So you can ask it to punctuate. You can ask it to emphasize on words. If there's a sort of colloquial pronunciation for certain words, you could take care of that as well. You could do things like, even breathing sounds, whispers, but not that you want to get into this because you've sort of established it's an automated call. But really, what we're going to see next is that the business results, right? So what we've seen over the last 3 weeks, and the brilliant thing about it is that we were actually able to roll this out in our 1 week or 2 weeks agile sprint, and it's been in production for only 3 weeks, and already we've seen a 10% improvement in schedule adherence for this demographic, which is huge, right? So it essentially means favorable patient outcomes, which is a massive impact, right? So 20% rider satisfaction. And cost savings. Now, cost savings for OneCall, because every time there's a missed appointment, your transportation provider will obviously charge you for a no-show, right? So that has obviously drastically gone down. So it doesn't stop there. So like I said, we try and use these sort of best-in-class solutions to solve real-world problems. That's why we partner with people like PubNub and AWS. So now that this use case has been implemented, it's out in production. Both sides, the enterprise and the customer, are now sort of warming up to these kind of solutions, and they're comfortable using them. So what we're going to do next is pick up more use cases where we can bring in this sort of automation to drive efficiency. Now, we're not taking away from what agents do. We're actually making them more effective, right? So one of the use cases that we saw, like 40% of all outbound calls that these agents were making were just to make sure that people have been indeed, dropped off at their desired location, right? So here's another use case where we use PubNub and these services together. So as soon as someone's dropped off, and they're dropped off, say, half a mile more than their desired location, the agent will get a ding on their desktop and saying, that's a variance issue. Something went wrong. Your patient is not where they should be. So what the agents typically do is they'll pick up the phone and call the patient saying, are you all good? Did you actually end up at your doctor's, or did the driver drop you somewhere else? Now, please remember that if they were dropped somewhere else, That's a big issue, right? Some of these guys have limited mobility. They may be on crutches. They may be using a walker. So not only patient suffering, but it can cause serious litigation issues for everyone involved. So what we're going to do is basically automate this flow as well. So this one's going to, in fact, integrate with Poly, Connect, and Lex. So the automated call is going to go saying, this is another automated call from Relay. We noticed that, you may not have reached your desired location. Are you sure you're at the right place? The person just replies, with a simple yes. If it's a yes, great, the issue is resolved. If it's a no, then we patch in an agent, and that's where the value of a human really comes into the picture, where they actually take care of that issue and then help the patient out. So that's really sort of the value of these kind of services. And the brilliant thing about it is the underlying tech is so high tech. It's artificial intelligence, machine learning, these fancy algorithms, but we're really using it to solve issues for the lowest tech demographic, right? Now, these are people who are actually on landline phones. Now, considering that we made an omni-channel solution, the first, reaction is to build an app. Now, everyone knows apps have, adoption issues. So what we did was we learned from that and basically, set up an SMS workflow, which works great, 80–90% of the time. It's a brilliant way to sort of orchestrate, these kind of rides, and appointments and such. But really, if you want this to be an inclusive solution, right, and you don't want any part of the demographic to get left behind, you need to sort of incorporate all these sort of high-tech tools out there, really, to do the job. So, yeah, thank you.